The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sherry Lichtenberg from NRRI, and welcome to our February webinar. Today we're going to talk about Lifeline, and we're very lucky. We're going to have an actual report from the field. We have with us some fantastic panelists who have been looking at this issue from all sides. So let me introduce our panelists and we'll get started. Let me remind you that you can send us your questions by using the questions bar on your dashboard, and we will try to get to all of the questions. So today we have the Honorable Crystal Rhodes, a commissioner from Nebraska. We have Olivia Wine from the National Consumer Law Center. I believe everyone knows Michelle Garber, who is the Vice President for Lifeline Programs at USAC. Michelle is joining us even though she has bronchitis. So if she has a problem, she has some backup folks on the line waiting to step in for her. We're very lucky today to have Gina Jasmine, who is the Director of Lifeline Operations for TracFone, one of the largest of the providers of Lifeline services. And last but certainly not least is Mike Ripperger, who is the Telecom Bureau Chief for the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. Mike has taken a look at how New Mexico is dealing with Lifeline now that they have been cut over to the National Verifier. So we have a great deal of information and lots to go through today. What we want to talk about is where we are in terms of cutting over the verifier, how customers are responding, whether the numbers of participants are changing based on the way in which they now need to enroll, and other questions regarding the way in which the National Verifier and the changes to the Lifeline program have been implemented. So we're going to start with some very brief discussions from our participants. Commissioner Rhodes, why don't you go first?
Oh, okay. I thought I was on second, but
oh, I did think you were on second, but go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So I'm Commissioner Rhodes from Nebraska. I have been monitoring all things Lifeline fairly closely for the last several years. Most recently, at the February NARUC meeting, I brought forward a resolution addressing some of the state's concerns about National Verifier and the impact that it was having on our Lifeline customers in various states. While I certainly understand and support the FCC's objectives, which are to, of course, protect against the waste, fraud, and abuse, lower the cost of the Universal Service Fund through creating administrative efficiencies and improving service for customers. I have some concerns about the parameters that they've given to USAC related to how National Verifier is being lost, and specifically the timeline. USAC has been tasked to launch in these states. Previously, last summer, NARUC also passed a resolution, asking and encouraging USAC and the FCC to do everything they can to connect with the existing federal databases to help facilitate the National Verifier. I know we're going to hear more from USAC in a little bit. I believe that they are trying to do that. However, one of the challenges is that data doesn't belong to the FCC, and in many cases belongs exclusively to the states. And working out a time frame for entering into those agreements takes a considerable amount of time. And in some cases, those databases simply don't exist. Because they don't exist, and because there have been restrictions on the type of documentation that now needs to be produced in order to facilitate enrollment or recertification or verification or any of the steps that we have set up to make sure that only people who are qualified are on the program, is actually creating so much of an impediment to the very people that we're trying to help that I fear they won't be able to access the services because those barriers are just are too high. The new eligibility documentation requirements don't allow for the use of SNAP electronic benefit transfer cards or the Medicaid enrollment cards as acceptable proof of Lifeline eligibility because in many places they do not have an expiration date. And while I certainly understand the principle that the FCC is kind of driving out there to make sure that we know that the participant is actually still eligible and enrolled in those programs before allowing them to enroll in Lifeline. The reality is that most of the people who would be eligible for this service are not going to maintain their eligibility or initial eligibility record letter, which is sent to them. And it really is problematic because in many states, including Nebraska, USAC has not been able to connect to our SNAP or Medicaid databases. So absent that, we have to figure out how we are going to facilitate that verification. Frankly, there just isn't a lot of time to do that. The time frames between when the FCC wants this done and when these connections can be established are just, in my view, completely unrealistic. And so we have a great deal of concern that what will happen is many eligible customers just simply won't be able to produce the documents that they're being asked for. That, I think, is kind of has been sort of the major sticking point from my perspective. There are a lot of folks that just simply are not going to be able to produce the documentation that's necessary. And since the FCC is not giving USAC adequate time to establish those database connections, we're going to see a real problem here. I think that's where I'm going to leave things for now, and then we'll see how it goes as the questions unfold.
That sounds great. Michelle, can you tell us where we are with the verifier and kind of sketch out what we know today and maybe even where we're going?
Certainly. Thank you again for having me today. And as Sherry mentioned, I'm a little under the weather, so I apologize if I pause or have any a little bit of coughing, and I will hand off to my colleagues as needed. I have a few minutes here to provide you a snapshot of where we are, but I also wanted to let the group know that we have a section on our website with some additional resources. We can provide information on that after the call if that's helpful, so people have some places to refer back to some of the things I say today. At this point, we've implemented the National Verifier in 24 states. 12 of those states have hard launched. What that means is that in those states, the National Verifier is required to be used versus in the initial launch, which we call the soft launch, where there's optional use of the system. So about half of them have hard launched. We have a carrier portal and a consumer portal available by a web-based login so that people can check their own eligibility or work with a carrier to help them check eligibility. And we also accept National Verifier applications through the mail if somebody prefers that method. The framework also includes a call center that is available 7 days a week that allows the carriers or the consumers or others that are participating in this process to call in, ask questions, or see the status of their applications. that's kind of the framework that we have set up at this point. As was mentioned already, we are expected to complete the remaining states on a pretty aggressive schedule. We have been directed to do that by the end of 2019. As directed by the FCC, we're using a combination of automated and manual eligibility verification methods. We do favor automation for obvious reasons, many of which Commissioner Rhodes just mentioned. But the challenge is there's no one single database that covers all eligibility program criteria. So at a federal level or even state by state, there's no one source. And so we're having to work with a lot of different agencies that have the data about the qualifying programs that are used for Lifeline. As a result, we have to prioritize given the timeline we're working within, and we have to deploy our resources in a manner that will make the most impact within the required timeline. So the first thing I wanted to talk about are some of the federal sources. These are beneficial to all states and territories because through a single database investment and technical effort, we can enable checking across all the states and territories. So we've implemented such a connection with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So at this point, any state or territory that's been implemented can have eligibility checked based on participation in federal public housing assistance. And we've entered into a similar agreement with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Service to build a connection that will offer a nationwide Medicaid check. We estimate that the Medicaid check through CMS could offer around 60% eligibility verification in any given state or territory. So that's an example of a channel that we want to focus on and prioritize because it creates a benefit across the whole framework. Beyond that, we look state by state to see the opportunity to automate further with other programs, namely with SNAP, because that is administered at the state and local level, and that data is not currently available at an aggregated federal level. And sometimes we can't enable those state connections. Commissioner Rhodes mentioned this already. In some cases, states have statutory limitations where they're not permitted to share that data. In other cases, they've had technical priorities that are not allowing the work to be performed within the timeline that we're trying to work against. And in other cases, it can be difficult to make the business case to invest in a particular state database connection if we think the volumes in that state will be relatively low after the federal sources are implemented. So what that brings us to at this point is in the 24 states that are launched, 8 of them have connections to SNAP and or Medicaid databases, in addition to that nationwide federal public housing assistance check. Where we have those SNAP or Medicaid connections, about 70% of the time, the people are able to be verified without having to send documentation to prove their participation in those programs. In some states, they are experiencing as much as 80% successful eligibility. And so we do see kind of a variety of experiences across the states, but it can be as high as 80%. Beyond the 24 states that are implemented, we have 4 additional states with whom we have worked on a computer matching agreement to access that state data. Those are actually currently published in the Federal Register, which is a necessary step in the process to enact those agreements. Those are in the Federal Register now, and barring any comments to the contrary, they would become effective in early March. That doesn't necessarily say that that's exactly when they would deploy, but that's an important dependency for us to be able to deploy a connection in those states. And there's about 20 additional state computer matching agreements that are in various stages of review between USAC, the FCC, and the state. The last thing I want to say in opening comments here is just that this whole project is a significant shift to the Lifeline program, a significant shift for our administration, responsibilities for the carriers and the states and the consumers' experiences. And it goes without saying that the project will experience challenges, and we want to continue to make improvements as we go. So with about 4 months under our belt since the first hard launch, which took place in November, people have now had time to sort of experience this, have feedback, draw some conclusions, and I look forward to conversations like today's so that we continue to get that feedback and work together to improve the framework.
Thank you, Michelle, and you got all the way through that without coughing, so thank you even more. Let me answer a quick question that I see coming in. The slide you are seeing is the only slide that we're using. As Michelle said, she will provide us with the link to the actual data and the reports on the USAC website after we get finished. So now that we know what has been implemented, let me turn this over to Gina Jasmine from TracFone to see what vendors are seeing in this space. So Gina, to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gina Jasmine, and I am the Senior Director of Lifeline Operations for TracFone Wireless. I have been working for TracFone for a little over 13 years. And in May 2008, I started working for a new department, Lifeline Services, under the direction of Javier Rosado, Senior Officer, Business Development and Government Services. Back then, we designed, developed, and implemented a new brand by the name of SafeLink Wireless to offer Lifeline benefits to eligible low-income households. In this webinar to discuss the current process of the National Verifier. First of all, I'd like to say that TracFone has been and continues to be a strong advocate of the National Verifier, recognizing its potential to protect against waste, fraud, and abuse, lower costs through administrative efficiencies, facilitate choice, and improve enrollment experience for beneficiaries. From the service provider's perspective, what we mainly see is that the process is not user-friendly, since consumers need to enter their information multiple times and interact with different websites. I'll explain in detail some of our concerns. Number one, lack of the application program interfaces. Before I continue, I must say that USAC and the FCC and some providers are working on implementing some type of APIs, but I'm just going to talk about the current process right now until that is developed. So there's a lack of the APIs between the National Verifier and the service providers. This is an issue not only for TracFone, but for all service providers. An API is necessary to enable direct communication of Lifeline applicant identifying, to be able to validate their identity and eligibility information from Lifeline providers to the National Verifier. We have encountered issues in which consumers' addresses are initially submitted to the National Verifier and sometimes do not exactly match the address that the consumer submits to the service provider, resulting in mistakes and consumers, there's a failure to enroll them or to approve them, even though they are found eligible in the National Verifier to receive Lifeline benefits. So these are just mistakes, manual mistakes, that if we did have an API interface, so the same information entered in the National Verifier will be submitted to the service provider to ensure that there is a perfect match, right? So that's one of our concerns. The second concern is the consumer's experience. It's cumbersome since they need to manually enter their personally identifiable information multiple times, once in the National Verifier system and the service provider's enrollment system, which also causes manual errors and mistakes in data entry. This manual process is a very bad experience for the consumer, even with the help of the service provider, since it requires the need to log into a manual National Verifier portal to validate Lifeline eligibility. The manual process is not the best option, and there is room for errors. But we highly recommend that the National Verifier use APIs in order to streamline the process and make it more user-friendly to the consumer. Similar like NLAS. We currently use APIs with the NLAS systems. So I think that National Verifier should also provide APIs. Number 3, in states where USAC launched the National Verifier with access to databases from SNAP and Medicaid, and also the Department of Housing and Urban Development, TracFone experienced better Lifeline approval results. Consequently, we emphasize that the USAC should prioritize launching the National Verifier in states where those databases exist. For example, the National Verifier approved approximately 70% of TracFone's new Lifeline applicants in New Mexico, where USAC has launched the National Verifier and where the National Verifier has access to SNAP, Medicaid, and HUD databases. In contrast, National Verifier approved only approximately 50% of new applicants in Mississippi, where the National Verifier has been hard launched and where the National Verifier has had only access to SNAP and HUD databases. TracFone also shared that when USAC used the manual process to access databases, Lifeline approvals were very low. And number 4 is the continued use of SNAP and Medicaid cards as proof of Lifeline eligibility should be reinstated. Or maybe we as providers and USAC and the FCC, we should explore other ways in which there could be additionally readily available information than that the low-income household users can use to prove the current enrollment in SNAP or Medicaid. For example, we could request the consumer to present a grocery receipt that has been used in the last 30 days. So that will show that they're currently receiving the SNAP benefits.
Thank you, Gina. And so you've done a great job of kicking this over to Mike. So Mike, everything is doing really well in New Mexico, right?
Well, hi. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate. Things are going probably better in New Mexico than they are in some of the other states. We are fortunate in that we have 3 databases running with the National Verifier, the SNAP, the Federal Housing, and Medicaid. Now, as a matter of background, we are not one of the states that had a state database previously. So all of the Lifeline providers in New Mexico were doing their own eligibility verifications. Now, when I was asked to say, okay, how are things going in your state, the first thing that I did was look to see how many Lifeline complaints did we have and what did they look like. And unfortunately, there were only 5 from the beginning of 2018, which seems really unusual considering the volume of Lifeline applicants that are in the state. And I can't say what that reason is for. We received complaints for a lot of different utilities here through a consumer relations division. But when I did look at those, 1 or 2 of them were somewhat telling about how the process went. We did have 1 complainant that had to work very, very hard they were de-enrolled and had to re-enroll. And through that process, which they were unusually dogged, they finally got enrolled, but it was discovered with a carrier who was a price cap carrier that there was a glitch in a system that may be affecting other Lifeline customers. So this points to the fact that all of the different carriers integrating into the system may be dealing with this differently, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. I do have to say that for the complaints that we have had, that for the most part, the carriers and in particular USAC have been very cooperative. They've been very timely. They've been quick to respond and try to resolve the issues with us. Now, in order for me to get another perspective on what was happening with Lifeline enrollments in the state, I emailed USAC and I said, look, can you give me the re-verification numbers for each of the programs? You know, for the 3 that are the automatic enrollments, and then how are you doing on the manual enrollment? What is the re-verification rate for those? They were able to, they didn't necessarily get back with each individual program re-verification rates, but they did come back and say that New Mexico is one of the states with you know, a high re-verification rate over 80%. So that was good. That means that the databases are talking and those are working. It doesn't mean that you know, some of the manual processes aren't cumbersome. I know that they have a back office sort of function for that they have other people do. So it's sort of a discovery process, but we are, unlike some of the other states who you have much higher manual enrollments, we are in a better place. The next thing that I looked at, I wanted to see, well, how are Lifeline enrollments, you know, over time since January 2018 to January 2019. And, you know, it shows the Lifeline disbursement data for each carrier, each ETC in the state, and how are those numbers trending. And overall, and, you know, I understand that for disbursements, sometimes they withhold disbursements, sometimes there'll be double disbursements, sometimes there's true-ups. And so without getting further into the data, I just assumed that this was a proxy for subscribership levels in the state. And from what I saw from January 18 to January 19, there was an 11% approximately reduction in reimbursements to carriers. Now, from what I've seen in the past, in New Mexico, the Lifeline subscribership numbers have been going down for several years. And I don't think that this is that far off from previous year's subscribership numbers. But when you dig down into the data and you look at each of the individual carriers, you notice that there's variations in those. Some are actually increasing disbursements to them. Some are declining. Some are holding steady. And you have a variety of different types of carriers in the state. You've got price cap, rate of return, Lifeline only providers. And you've got a few wireless providers. You've got providers who rely on tribal Lifeline for a lot of their revenue. So, you know, without reading too much into the data, there might be things going on with each of the carriers that are lending to some of these numbers. So, but that's as far as I've gotten.
Well, that's really good information. Olivia, as at the National Consumer Law Center, what are you all seeing in terms of Lifeline participants? Are the numbers going down? Are you getting complaints? Help us understand the process and the type of consumers who need and want Lifeline.
Sure. I just want to step back for a second and introduce myself. I am a staff attorney, Olivia Wine, at the National Consumer Law Center, and we are a nonprofit that originally started off as a legal services support center, so we are very tied to legal services still. We focus on the low-income consumers' access to essential utility service, and we consider voice and broadband essential services. I am also on the board of USAC, but I'm not here representing USAC, and my comments are not on behalf of USAC. I'm here today as the staff attorney at NCLC and a longtime low-income consumer and Lifeline advocate. So I had to make that disclosure. Diving into the substance of what's been said, the consumer advocates have been very supportive of the National Verifier and are very vested in this working well. We have been concerned that program design not inadvertently create barriers to entry, so we are very concerned about how SNAP participants now must prove eligibility, as well as those without a traditional U.S. Postal Service address, what that process looks like for them to sign up, because right now it is there are multiple steps, and it's not very clear. So we are looking for a seat at the table. When these conversations are occurring as to like, how do we figure out solutions, workable solutions for SNAP participants to demonstrate their eligibility, we would like consumer advocates also at that table. For example, if the answer is something like a SNAP card and recent receipt of a transaction, we can bring folks to the table with that type of expertise to help with that conversation. Again, the issue with the U.S. Postal Service, because the Lifeline application does not accept a P.O. box number, but you do have populations both like in remote tribal areas, remote regions of the country, as well as urban homeless that are needing to figure out this solution. So some specific trainings as to how to approach that, some creative solutions as to a method for proving eligibility that satisfies the program integrity concerns. We'd like consumers to be at that table for that conversation as well. In general, another thing that we're hearing is like there's an appetite and a desire for the trainings. This is a new drill. How you sign up for Lifeline is new. And when we talk about Lifeline in the field, we do find that there is great interest in this program and an appetite. And so, I mean, maybe there's time later at the end to talk about this, but I just wanted to give a 4 examples. I was on the phone yesterday with legal services in the Southwest, and the attorney was talking about a project they have that helps young adults in foster care transition to independence. So these are foster care young adults in group housing that get a stipend if they're working or in school. And here's where a Lifeline phone would be very helpful. It would help them with jobs, staying in touch with their employer, picking up extra shifts, helping them with their schoolwork and navigating education assignments and staying in touch with their teachers. It helps them stay in touch with the attorneys and social workers that are part of their support team to help ensure success. But you know, they need a regular number that's reliable, so that they have this ability to connect with each other. So, you know, that attorney, I said, well, do you know if your clients are on Lifeline? And she said, you know, tell me a little bit more about Lifeline. And then she said, you know, they probably are Lifeline eligible. I'm not sure if they're on Lifeline, but they really should know about this program. So again, I think there's an appetite out there if we can make that outreach and education more robust, and I think it's even more critical now that the drill has changed and the process for proving eligibility is shifting. It's a dramatic change from the regular.
So, Olivia, that's a really good point. I know that we've talked about the question of some SNAP cards not having actual dates on them, or maybe I think I've heard that some don't have names on them. And I think it was you, Commissioner Rhodes, who suggested a grocery or a transaction receipt to back that up. And so we have a question already saying, okay, I've never used a SNAP card, so what does that receipt look like?
That's the conversation that we need to have. We need to see like what these receipts in the different states look like, and if that is enough to satisfy program integrity. But that would be, although it's an additional step, it's probably more an easier one to meet than to expect a SNAP recipient to always carry around with them or have within easy reach, you know, their letter notifying them that they have been awarded, they have qualified for their SNAP benefit. I mean, that eligibility determination for SNAP is probably something that got, you know, put in the recycle bin fairly quickly, or, you know, is just harder to find. And, you know, if it involves the recipient going home again to come back, I think then you've created a huge barrier to entry, and chances are that that customer will not come back to apply for Lifeline.
Gina, have you seen a similar type of issue?
Yes, definitely. That's what I mentioned before, that perhaps if the consumer provides a receipt from the grocery store that they just use the SNAP card, that will help, because that's probably something that they can keep, and it will be easier to provide than keeping that rewarding letter that they probably don't have anymore, or they would have to go back to the SNAP office to be able to get a copy of it. So it's cumbersome to have the consumer request the awarding letter for a SNAP. They don't keep that.
This is Crystal, and I would also add to that even if you were to be able to implement something like that as a short-term kind of solution until those database connections were able to be established, it's still really critical that be the direction that we're moving. In my state, we also have a state universal service program. We also supply an additional subsidy. In addition to what the federal Lifeline is, we have another subsidy that we add from our state fund. And, the mechanism for verification is in our statute. And so it's frustrating because in order to, there's one set of criteria for the federal program, there's one set for the state. The state we can adjust ours to mirror or to just say, if you've been, certified through the National Verifier, that's good enough for us. But that takes legislation. That takes time to do, rewrites of our rules and regs. That takes adjustments to our databases. And this timeline, and I'll say it again, is just completely unrealistic and harmful to the very people that we're trying to serve.
So, Michelle, can you talk for a couple of minutes about the new application? What I've heard is an 8-page application that is different from what we saw in the past, and whether you are seeing that as an issue with some of the applicants. What happens when someone needs to fill it out and mail it in?
Sure. So the applications, formerly there wasn't a universal application for applying for Lifeline or recertifying for Lifeline. There were rules in the FCC's rules and orders that indicated what such an application should include, but then states and carriers kind of had different versions of that type of a form. So they definitely varied. Previously, in July of last year, the FCC established universal forms that would make that consistent for anyone applying for federal Lifeline benefits. And in so doing, kind of designed a form. Obviously, USAC participated in that process. The form that we have now, I think the main concern people have is that when printed, it's 8 pages. 4 of those pages are the actual data that needs to be collected and the certifications that need to be collected. There are a couple of other sections that are conditional depending on your circumstances, but there are 4 pages that are actually the data. The rest of it does include various statements and disclosures that have to be included. But I can understand, this comment that people have that printing out 8 pages feels, potentially overwhelming. What we're experiencing as the National Verifier is like less than or right around 1% of the applications are coming in by mail. We're seeing about, I think it's over 80% of the applications are from consumers that are going to our online portal to fill it out. And when you're on the portal, it's, there are different screens that ask you questions. So it's not the same experience as if you had sort of printed the whole thing out and looked at all 8 pages at one time.
Gina, can you comment on that?
Yes, we do have consumers that are actually called to complain because they haven't been qualified to receive Lifeline services, and the reason that is mostly because they do not send all the pages or they send portions of the mail of the application. They also complain because previously, before National Verifier, the providers, and I'm talking about TracFone, we used to mail an application to their home, and they will fill it up and send it back to us, and we will pay for the postage. So right now, that's not happening. So consumers don't want to use the mail channel anymore to apply. So they are pretty much forced to go to the portal. And we have consumers that are disabled that really cannot read the application or have issues. And even the portal is not. The National Verifier portal does not have disabilities access. So we are getting a few complaints from consumers that the application is too long to fill. They don't want to spend money on postage, and our disabled consumers don't have access to apply through the National Verifier.
So, Olivia, what are the ways that we could start reaching out to these consumers to find a way to help them until all of the APIs are in place?
I think it's critical to do sort of a multi-layered outreach and education strategy. I think that sort of along the lines of training the trainer, like the frontline service organizations, community-based organizations, as well as who help low-income consumers with their SNAP benefits or with their Medicaid benefits, or you're getting this, the idea in public housing. If they're aware of how the Lifeline application process works, they can help sort of educate the consumer as well. I think, to the extent there can be sort of little mini, even like little video clips of this is how you fill out the form if you are, if you only have a PO box. This is, so these those little mini things, not that like low income don't tend to, they fall on the wrong side of the broadband divide often, but again, if it's a train the trainer, that makes those train the trainer sessions easier to organize, and it makes it easier to push out sort of the information in bite-sized pieces, sort of modules focused on where the pain points are right now. I think would be very, very important. But that would be my pitch and my plea. I think it needs to be certainly an area of focus to get through the immediate period. But I think that it would benefit everybody if the affected stakeholders could be working together on how to minimize the barriers, like practical ways to minimize the barriers, so that we can come up with a solution that is probably more fire tested and would sort of work better for consumers, be understandable, reach sort of vulnerable populations, low literacy populations, limited English proficiency populations, consumers with disabilities, different disabilities. There are groups out there that are frontline groups that help these communities with other benefits. So these would be the trainers that we would, I think, would be at the top of the list to train on how to enroll low-income clients into the Lifeline program.
So Mike and Crystal, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. This is Michelle. I just wanted to flag a quick thing. I completely agree with everything Olivia just said about that approach. We've started to do that at USAC. I think there's a lot more we can do. We have some videos on our website that we want to make more people aware of. We've been out and visited with some social service offices that already work with the people that might be applying for Lifeline, and in many cases left how-to guides behind with us so that those offices can help people. So I think we're moving in the direction that Olivia's talking about. And it's just something we have to keep focused on. And I know Olivia's not here as a board member, but she's also been a great resource for us as a USAC board member to generate some new ideas about how we can expand that. And then the only other thing I wanted to flag is if people are finding that consumers' applications are being rejected for not sending in all 8 pages, we would definitely want to know that, because that's not the intent. And we will mail an application to someone if they request that. So just want to make sure if people are having a different experience that we know that so we can correct it. Thank you.
So I think that's excellent, and you actually led into the question that I've got for Commissioner Rhodes and for Mike. What are your thoughts in terms of how the state commissions can help with this, or how we would reach out?
Well, I know that USAC has been working with our staff to, Nebraska's launch is going to be coming up here soon, to try and figure out that framework. Now, our state commission does have access to our Medicaid database, and we can use that for the initial launch to kind of help smooth out that transition. I don't think that we have figured out the logistics for for the long term, but I do know in the short term that is something that we are going to try to work with them to facilitate. So at least in Nebraska, that's a kind of half-step measure. Of course, the question is, what will how will the state Medicaid administrator respond to us acting as an intermediary? Will they allow us to continue that? Will they be willing to work with USAC? Like, there's just so many unanswered questions as it relates to that. But we're certainly going to try to do the best that we can to have this be as seamless as a transition as possible for the existing Lifeline customers. I think that's kind of where we're at right now.
So, Mike, what are your thoughts? You seem to be being very successful in New Mexico. What's causing that, do you think?
Well, I think that, the overall numbers look like, okay, great. We're getting good, re-verification numbers. We're getting good, maybe certification numbers. But the thing that I worry about is we have 5 complaints over a year. And you wonder, why is it that all these Lifeline customers, if they are having issues, and I know it can be difficult sometimes to get signed up, even with, whatever help you can get. We know it's a 2-step process and can be cumbersome for customers. How is it that, what can we do at the commission to say, here's an avenue. If you have an issue or a complaint, we have a good working relationship with USAC. The providers tend to, work with us. How can we make it so that they can turn to us in case they feel frustrated about trying to enroll, or what's happened with their Lifeline service? So I think that's something that's we need to take back here at the commission, look at.
Gina, can you add to that? As a provider, what are you seeing for customers that are having issues, and how are you able to help them, and what help can we try to work to help you?
Well, I would say that currently I work with USAC closely, very closely. They support all our issues and problems. They help to us. We do get a lot of help from USAC. So we are trying to solve issues as they come. And one of the problems that currently is happening quite a bit is when customers enter their home address on the National Verifier portal, and for example, they spell the avenue as AVE, and then they come and apply for services with us. They enter their home address a little different, like they may spell AV only. So that, since the National Verifier right now does not have address standardization, that's a failure because the National Verifier is expecting 100% match from what was entered during the National Verifier and when they enter the address on the service provider. Therefore, there are issues there, and I have brought up because consumers are complaining that they are found eligible in the National Verifier, so they are 100% eligible, but when they come to apply for the services with the provider, we are failing them because the National Verifier did not identify the consumer with the correct address. Now, the ENLA system does the standardization, so I think the only issue there is the National Verifier needs to apply the same, and that will solve the problem for unmatches or for the others, only for the others. I would say that this is something that TracFone highly recommends, is that if USAC is gonna roll out a hard launch state in the National Verifier, that they should have access to the Medicaid and SNAP databases. Because about 80% of the consumers, Lifeline consumers, they receive benefits from SNAP or Medicaid. Therefore, if USAC launches a state with those databases, then the approval percentage is going to be high. There's going to be very less issues with consumers trying to provide supporting documentation or SNAP cards that don't have days or anything like that. Therefore, we strongly suggest that USAC should only launch states that have those two databases. If they have access to those two state databases, they have about 80% approval rate on Lifeline.
So, Michelle, let me break this into two sets of questions and direct them to you. Address verification, as I remember well from my days trying to get local service implemented at the beginning of the Act, it has always been something very difficult. Yet NLAD seems to be okay, and as Gina says, there's something different with the verifier. Can you help us understand first what we could do as a workaround, and secondly, what are your plans to try to make this verification work better?
Sure. First of all, I wanted to kind of go back to the description Gina gave. There is address standardization in the National Verifier system. So to the extent that an address is able to be standardized, which Sherry gets, to your point, we basically have a system that we use to check the address that's entered against the U.S. Postal Service and basically make sure that it's a valid address. If it can be found, then it is standardized, and the standardization in the NLAD system and the National Verifier system are consistent. So to the extent that somebody with an identifiable, validated address is using avenue or street versus the abbreviations, that shouldn't give them trouble. So again, if that's a different experience than people are having, we'd want to know that. What is true, though, is that if they enter a different address in each system, they will get a failure. And if the address isn't able to be standardized, that's where we run into more issues. So, we have somebody with an address that's in a rural or a tribal area, or someone that has a descriptive address because they are homeless. Those are addresses that postal service system is not going to find. And then it becomes very important that it's entered exactly the same way because we have nothing else to standardize it. The other experience that I know people are having is, in those instances, what kind of document can I provide that proves that this is a real address? Utility bills are acceptable, for example, but we know that can be a limiting factor, particularly if you think about the homeless population. So this it's not a new challenge, to your point, Sherry, that checking addresses And I think as we work towards that API that Gina mentioned, where the carrier can interact with NLAD and NV in a little bit more seamless way, we'll have less issues with that matching.
So I know that when I order something online and I put in my address to send it, very often I'll get a pop-up that says, okay, this is the standardized address and you didn't enter it. Would you rather use that? I take it that the verifier doesn't do that at this point. Would that be a possible way to start to fix this problem, if you will?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're describing because we've talked about that at USAC. That is happening behind the scenes, but what's happening is it's saying, okay, the standardized version of this address is this, and then behind the scenes, that's what's getting stored. But what we're not doing is what you described, which is showing that to the user and saying, hey, this is the standardized address. Now, that said, when you then go over to the National Verifier or back and forth between the National Verifier and NLAD, that same standardization is happening behind the scenes, so it shouldn't be throwing an error. But I think there is some benefit to showing people, hey, we are standardizing your address to this different format. But it should still not be giving a problem behind the scenes.
So we should probably start in the various states, and I know that we have almost 90 people on listening to this, that we should start collecting that kind of information so that we can do some troubleshooting of this. And would that be helpful to you, Michelle?
Absolutely. You know, these systems and processes have been designed and tested by USAC, but they're going to be different scenarios that we might not have thought of or seen before. So we really do want to hear if someone's having an unexpected experience so we can diagnose that.
So let's talk a little bit about these APIs. We all talk about APIs a lot, but I'm not sure everybody understands what we're talking about. And I think we tend to get confused between the consumer portal and the provider portal. So can you help us, Gina, why don't you start? How do consumers actually work with you to order Lifeline?
Sure. Consumers usually go to our website or and they apply using their information. They can also go to a streeting agent and request to apply for the service. And usually it's a simple process, right? Currently on a non-national verifier, it's a simple process only because it's only one step for the consumer. They go to the carrier that they want to get Lifeline services from, they apply, and then we do the validation, we do all the screening before we send it to NLAS for final approval. And that has been working fine. On the national verifier stage, now it's a little bit more difficult to the carrier because we lost a lot of the visibility. Now the consumer goes directly to the national verifier, applies for eligibility for Lifeline services, and then once the consumer is found eligible to receive Lifeline benefits, then the consumer has to go out there and look for the service provider. And then when they do come to us, we check and ensure that they have been approved for the national verifier. And if everything is okay, like the happy path, if everything is okay, then they have been approved for national verifier, they will continue we will continue to enroll the consumer and send it to national verifier for validation, then send it to NLAD to check for duplicates. And then if NLAD and national verifier is approved, then the consumer is enrolled and we can provide services to the consumer. Now, I'd like to make a note. I know that Michelle, I'm glad to hear that there is a standardization or the address happening on the National Verifier and behind the scenes, and that's perfect. I'm glad to hear that, but the issue is not on the National Verifier. The issue is when the consumer comes to the service provider and applies for the for Lifeline. Since the National Verifier is correcting the address on the back end, the consumer has no visibility on how it was corrected. Therefore, when they come to the service provider, they enter the address with wrong abbreviations, and of course, there is no match, and therefore, those are the failures that we're seeing. So, so what I just trying to say is that the National Verifier may be working and validating the address and doing standardization on their system. The problem is that the consumer is not seeing what's being entered, and when they do come to the service provider, they're entering a total different abbreviation for the address. So that's the issue that we're having. And obviously, the National Verifier doesn't see that because they are able to validate the address, standardize it, and make sure that it's a correct address and approve the consumer. The problem is when they do go to the service provider. So this issue will be resolved when the APIs are implemented, because the same address that is being validated by the National Verifier is the same address that will be sent to the service provider.
So, Michelle, just a quick question, and then I know that Olivia wants to join in here. If I pass these checks and I am validated, do I get like a piece of paper or an email to carry over to my provider that provides this data, or how do I know I've been approved as a consumer?
Sure. If a consumer is working in the portal online to check their eligibility, at the conclusion of the process, there's a screen that pops up that indicates the outcome of the review, and it also tells them the information, the personal identifiable information that they entered, and says, okay, you know, based on this identity information that you entered, you are eligible. So that's something they could print. And they could take that to their provider. If they are applying through another method, through the mail, they would receive an email or a letter. They have, it depends what contact information we have from them, an email or a letter, you know, letting them know that they've qualified as well. So it can kind of depend on how they're applying and how they've requested to receive that confirmation.
So a lot of this seems to depend on my already having some sort of consumer access, computer access to the program. But there's certainly not a lot of these consumers, I think of the homeless or others who are just, you know, people with disabilities who can't get out and get to a computer. So they default into the manual process?
They don't have to be, they don't have to have their eligibility checked manually, but they may be submitting manually, if you will. So if I don't have access to the internet or to a computer, I might mail in my application. That application, when it's received by USAC, the first thing we do is check it against any available data sources, the same way we would an online application. So we check it against all the available data sources after we enter it into our system. It could be that that application is able to be approved based on those automated connections, and if so, we would then send an email if they'd provided an email address. Unlikely in this example we're using because they're not, you know, interacting with a computer, or a physical mail letter to them saying, we've reviewed your application and you have been successful. If they include supporting documentation with their application, which we encourage people to do if they're mailing it in, because we don't want to have too much back and forth. That way, if the automated checks aren't successful, we already have those documents and we can look at them. But if they don't do that and we do need documents from them, again, we would either email or send them a letter letting them know that we needed more information and making sure they had our call center number for help with that.
So, Olivia, I know you have some questions as well, so let me turn it over to you.
One quick question. So let's say the consumer went on to the online portal and was successful, and then they get the screen that says based on this personal information. So the address listed there has already gone through the standardization. If they were to plug in that address exactly as it looks into, like, say, the track phone application form, then there should be no problem. Is that the issue? Is that,
that's right.
Like, if you're training somebody, that's what we should say, use this exact format?
That's right, Olivia. To the extent that the address is entered as it's shown, everything should be fine. When TracFone, for example, is taking in that information and ultimately submitting it to NLAD for enrollment. So I think, Gina's brought up a number of challenges with this process, and I know, as she mentioned, we work with her pretty regularly, so we'll definitely be following up and seeing if we can get some use cases here where things haven't gone as expected to make sure that's working properly.
Thank you. I also just wanted to put on everybody's radar screen something that's more future state with the computer matching agreements. It's a possibility. It's something that is going to require some advocacy. The Farm Bill that was signed into law December 2018 includes this requirement. It's a new requirement for the SNAP program that they have to create an interstate data matching program. It sounds, like a duplicates check process. And they have to build this within 3 years after this, 3 years from December 2018. So it's future state, but this would, if the National Verifier had an ability to tap into that sort of mega, database of all the state SNAP databases for the purpose of Lifeline enrollment, Lifeline eligibility, that could help in some of the states that are already in hard launch that do not have a SNAP computer matching agreement. So I just wanted to put that out there on the radar screen. It's going to require some advocacy to have the National Verifier tap into that, but SNAP has to build their duplicates check database.
So, Michelle, I know you're trying to tap into the National Medicaid database. Is this one on your radar as well?
Absolutely. Again, just everything Olivia said, we want to keep an eye out for that, see how that develops, and certainly want to access any data source that provides a single connection point that can serve, across all the consumers in the different states and territories. There's this has been a great discussion today, and I think I kind of said in my opening remarks, this is a complex project. There's a lot of moving parts, and it certainly is not without its challenges, as any project of this size would be. And we are sympathetic to the processes that consumers are being subjected to through this National Verifier, and making sure that we're looking for ways to improve them. And automation through sources like that is certainly a key part of that, as is just this overall feedback, so that we can continue to streamline and make improvements wherever possible.
So I want to remind everyone in the audience that we look forward to having your questions. We're about 15 minutes away from the end, so if you have questions, please type them in and we'll try to go through them. And here is a very interesting one, and Michelle, I'm glad that your cough medicine is working well, because this one is for you. Is the consumer portal, does it conform to Section 508 standards, which are the accessibility standards for federal computer systems? I assume that means big letters or other kinds of things that make a system more accessible.
Yes, the system was designed to be 508 compliant, which, yes, as you mentioned, it will be useful to people that may have different disabilities as they're interacting with the system.
Excellent. Thank you. And everyone, please keep sending in your questions. Mike, let me talk to you in terms of what you're seeing. One of the issues, of course, that we have seen is that the FCC has standardized the programs that count to make customers eligible for Lifeline, but the state programs aren't necessarily identical. Are you seeing any kind of that issue in New Mexico, or is New Mexico's program using exactly the same?
Thank you, Sherry. No, New Mexico is not using the same. We, like Nebraska, we have a $3.50 match, and we maintained the original criteria even after the feds changed their criteria for the $3.50 match, which means that there can be circumstances where someone is eligible for the state program but not eligible for the federal program. Or in the alternative, you could be eligible for the, let's say, the veterans benefits on the federal side and get that, but not get the state match. What we have found is, in talking to the providers, is that they have worked pretty hard to get customers qualified through a program where they can get both benefits. And we, as of maybe about a year ago or a little more, I think there were a total of all the Lifeline customers that all the providers that we queried had. They think there were about 2 customers who were only getting the state benefits. So I have to give some kudos to the companies to go and work with the customers to get on those programs that match both the state and the federal criteria.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. Crystal, how are you all going to deal with that in Nebraska as the verifier cuts over?
We are not entirely certain at this time. We have started some conversations about whether or not it would be appropriate for the commission to open a docket to kind of change our criteria. But again, we have some criteria that's set by statute, and it's not just a simple thing that the commission can just do. And so we're going to have to, we're going to have to work through that. At this time, we really don't know.
And I assume that there are there are a significant number of states out there that are going to have the same issue. I have a couple of questions from the audience, one directed specifically to you, Mike. How many Lifeline customers are there in New Mexico?
Well, that is a good question. We have total dollar figures per month, and I didn't divide through to see as a proxy because it includes link-up payments. How many we actually have right now. I do know that USAC got back to me about the total number of applications, I guess since the hard launch, since mid-February, and that's 14,000 customers, but I don't think that's the final number. So I would have to go back and actually figure that out.
After the program, I will give you the name of the person asking, and we can go through and try to get that answer. Another question. Yes.
Sherry, this is Michelle. I can answer that question. There are 90,000
right.
as of the end of 2018.
I'm sorry, would you say again?
90,000 as of the end of 2018.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, also just a point of clarity, that is based on our federal Lifeline program numbers. So I know Mike mentioned that there can be some, differing criteria, but that's based on the federal Lifeline program numbers.
That is terrific. Thank you for having that answer at your fingertips. There is another question to you, and it is about recertification. And I'm going to read it because it is a very interesting question, so let me read it directly. Relative to recertification through access to databases, what assurances does the FCC or USAC have that the consumers who receive free Lifeline wireless supported services are actually the person still using that service? That is, that I don't hand you my phone and say, go, have a good time.
Sorry, Sherry, it just took me a minute to get unmuted.
That is fine, Michelle.
I thought I was unmuted. The certifications that are on the application and on the recertification form, if you will, are, they require people to certify that they won't give their phone to another person, that they will be the one to use this benefit, that they understand this benefit is theirs under penalty of perjury. So those are self-certifications that the FCC has implemented to protect against that, and that's the level of protection that the FCC has in its rules right now.
And Gina, I hear somebody who wants to chime in.
It's Olivia, but also the Lifeline benefit is a per household benefit. So the person enrolling as one member of the household is allowed, other members of the household are entitled to use that phone as well.
Thank you. That is a good update. Another question, one of the things that will be changing in the Lifeline program is that standalone voice will start being phased out as we move to the end of the year, and we'll start seeing a reduction in the amounts of subsidy paid. What is USAC going to do to manage that process? Have you begun to think about that, Michelle?
I'm not sure what you mean by manage the process, but as an administrator, we certainly have to update any of our systems or processes to pivot in that direction. So with that direction, we will be recalculating disbursements at a different rate if someone has enrolled in a product that is voice only. I'm not sure what else you mean by USAC management.
No, I think that is actually, I think that's actually the question, is you'll be reducing the payments to the companies to ensure that they meet, or if they don't meet the requirements, right?
That's right. That's right. We collect data about the type of service that the consumer has signed up for. And so anywhere that we see that service is not inclusive of the qualifying broadband, it'll be a reduction to the calculated disbursement. That's right.
And can you talk a little bit, I know we have mentioned the fact that you're going to give us the website address about the reports that will be or are now up on the website. Can you talk about the kind of reports that we're going to be able to see?
Right now, the reports that are on the website provide a lot more about sort of status, where are we, some high-level measures of volumes that we're seeing and pass rates that we're seeing based on database checks. We're working with the FCC to try to put out a little bit more of a data-driven view that can be updated on a more regular basis that we can post to our website. So I think that will be coming soon. The information that's on the website now is a little bit more narrative form, and we want to be able to provide some data points that people can look at, ask questions, see what they're seeing, and really make sure there's a balanced view of the data that's out there so that we can all be on the same page. So that's something that's coming soon.
And so I would assume that you would encourage the states to take a look at that information to help them in looking at the way in which the program is working for them.
Exactly. Just like Mike mentioned, that he had worked with us to get some information about what we're seeing in the National Verifier so far in New Mexico. Obviously, we want to continue to do that with each state, as that conversation continues, but we also want to make some of that information more publicly available so that it doesn't have to be on request.
Fantastic. Another question, and for you, Michelle, and let me open this up to comments from the rest of the participants. Do we know if companies are making robocalls to encourage consumers to recertify, or have you taken a look at that?
So any issue of compliance around robocalls would be something that the FCC would handle in terms of the rules around that. But I do know that as a recertification effort is kicking off, we do have a number of different ways as the National Verifier as well as carriers to let people know that certain required processes are coming. And so, you can make a phone call, or in some cases a text might be sent to alert the customer that they have an action that they need to take. So again, there are instances of that are being used, appropriately to remind customers of an action that they need to take to retain their Lifeline benefit. But to the extent that there was any evidence of abuse in some fashion, that would be something that would need to be reported to the FCC.
Fantastic. Let me, Olivia, turn a question over to you. We've seen a change in the standards, the minimum standards for Lifeline. The number of minutes that are required, the fact that we're going to need to have broadband as well as standalone voice. Are you hearing that whether there's been an impact from that?
It is something that we are looking at closely. The consumer advocates advocated strongly for minimum standards in the 2016 Lifeline modernization order. There have been a lot of things sort of affecting program design. So we are very concerned overall about any decline in subscribership. We are also concerned if there's a reduction in sort of product offerings in the marketplace. And so it's more like we are looking for some type of analysis to see what Lifeline subscribers are choosing, what their choices are, and is it changing? And so we are very aware that there's this potential for further market disruption in not a good way. So we would like data, and we would like to stay on top of it, and we would like this program to sort of stabilize so that we can get to the point where we are seeing a robust marketplace with a lot of competitive offerings. And I think the concern from the consumer advocacy groups is that we're actually going in another direction right now, and it's difficult without an analysis to pin the blame on exactly one thing. And so I'll just sort of lay that out there. But we are very concerned about anything causing a drop in subscribership, anything. We were hoping for a robust sort of broadband service offering. If we're not seeing that, we'd like to know why. We certainly value voice. That is an important, especially in this era of natural disasters, it's access to emergency services. It is critical. So we don't want to see a loss in that product offering, and we certainly, consumer groups have been very strong in talking about the importance of the free prepaid wireless product offering helping the most vulnerable consumers. So we don't want to see any loss of that product offering in the marketplace.
So let me offer that NRRI would like very much to be a bridge between the commissions and USAC and the consumer organizations. So perhaps we can talk offline about how we can collect this kind of data and make sure that it gets to the folks who need to see it. We are 2 minutes away from the end, so let me ask if anyone has anything specific that they would like to end with, and then let me talk for a minute about our next webinar. So let me start with you, Crystal. Any additional comments?
No, I'm going to look forward to continuing this conversation with USAC and with the other states, and we will continue to try to work through this.
Fantastic. Mike?
Well, I would just say that, yeah, I would echo kind of NARUC's advocacy on a lot of the issues, and also I think that our commissioners here would be concerned about, you know, Lifeline subscribership and how the changes in the Lifeline program coming up might affect people's ability to get Lifeline service going forward in those numbers.
And Michelle?
I just wanted to thank you, Sherry, for creating a platform like this for us to have this conversation. Again, looking forward to continuing to work with the panelists and others in their sort of circles to continue the conversation. And then please let me know how I can provide links to some of the reports. We mentioned a lot of data and information here and want people to be able to refer back to that.
If you provide me with those links, we will send it out to all the participants, and we'll also post it on the NRRI website. And Olivia, you get to tie this all up.
Well, thank you, Sherry, for organizing this excellent discussion. I'm hoping that this is one of many discussions, because this is an important year for the Lifeline program. There's just a lot of changes on the horizon with the National Verifier, with minimum standards. I see opportunities to collaborate with trainings. I see opportunities to collaborate with advocacy. And I think this is such an important program for low-income consumers to have essential communication services. And it is really important that the changes that are being put in place work well, and we minimize barriers to entry.
Fantastic. And so let me thank all of our panelists for being so forthcoming. Let me tell you, Michelle, go and rest your voice and get well soon. Our next webinar is March 13th. It's on enhancing the resilience of the nation's electricity system. And it's based on a report from the National Academies of Science about how the system can be made to be more resilient and to make sure that we don't have any significant losses. The moderator will be Carl Peckman, the director of NRRI, and we will actually have 3 of the folks who participated in that development. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you join our next NRRI webinar, and we are done.
Thank you.
Thank you.